Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. One particular video format that I have become rather fond of watching online are those that revolve around the iceberg theory. Informational content that is based around the premise that if you play a game and nothing more, you can only see what is present above the surface. In today's video instead, we are going to take a deep dive beneath and look at the many wonderful facts surrounding one of my all-time favourite fighting game releases. X-Men vs Street Fighter is a video game that would change the world forever. So without further ado, this is the X-Men vs Street Fighter Iceberg Explained. Yeah! X-Men vs Street Fighter is a significant video game as it would allow for various fighters from two completely different universes to cross over into a scenario that was so epic that prior to this game's release, most gamers would not have even been able to conceptualize such a cool idea to begin with. The working relationship between Marvel and Capcom would begin in 1993 with the release of the high-quality Punisher game, a cooperative side-scrolling arcade brawler that would also see a conversion released on the Sega Mega Drive. The first Capcom-produced fighting game featuring Marvel-licensed characters was released in the arcades in 1994, and would feature a few of the tropes that would be used in X-Men vs Street Fighter and future Marvel vs Capcom games. Amongst these would include air combat and aerial combos, taking versus fighting to the skies for the first time. Children of the Atom also included Akuma as a secret opponent, who first appeared in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo as a secret character before this. His creation and inclusion in Street Fighter was originally inspired by an April Fool's Day hoax that was published by Electronic Gaming Monthly. His resurfacing in X-Men Children of the Atom proved so popular it became clear that gamers were hungry for more Street Fighter and X-Men crossovers down the line. Both Children of the Atom and X-Men vs Street Fighter would both feature X-Men character sprite work inspired by the 1992 animated series. Speaking of this show, the games and the TV programme would also feature the same voice actors. This depiction of the X-Men would differ from those found in X-Men the arcade game published in 1992 by Konami, as the sprites in that game would be based off of an earlier pilot for the show, known as Pride of the X-Men, that would air back in 1989. The play and graphical style found in Children of the Atom would also be included in Marvel Superheroes, released in 1995. This versus fighting game that includes a roster of fighters from the wider Marvel universe would once again include some X-Men as characters. X-Men vs Street Fighter upon its arrival would include sprite work taken from these earlier Marvel Capcom games, with the Street Fighter side of the roster having their sprites taken from Street Fighter Alpha 2. It is of note though that in X-Men Children of the Atom, Akuma had his Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo sprite, which does not blend with the rest of the roster close to as well. X-Men Children of the Atom predates the Alpha series, you see. Speaking of the characters, Rogue, Gambit and Sabretooth would all make their Capcom game debuts in this title, thus meaning their sprites were created specifically for this game. In terms of Street Fighter characters, X-Men vs Street Fighter marks Cammy's first appearance being depicted as a member of M. Bison's criminal organisation known as Shadaloo. This same sprite would be included in an updated version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 known as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, and would later also be used in Street Fighter Alpha 3. Completely new to this game and not seen in Capcom's previous Marvel efforts was the introduction of tag team mechanics, a series staple that would forever become synonymous with multiple Marvel vs Capcom games. Mechanically, other new features would be introduced for the first time, such as variable counters and variable combinations that would mix up gameplay further. Since the X-Men are larger than life superheroes, to match up to their capabilities, the Street Fighter combatants were given an overhaul for the game, allowing them to perform much bigger, more impressive moves than they could before. This includes the likes of a new variant of Hadouken for Ryu, where the manoeuvre now fills up a huge chunk of the screen, which results in attacks that are more reminiscent of moves that someone would see in Dragon Ball Z, rather than in Street Fighter. Another interesting feature this game includes is the introduction of Apocalypse as a final boss. This character is completely different from any that had been seen in a fighting game previously, since he fills up the majority of the screen in combat. He is also the only character in the game who does not have a tag team partner. However, if a player is able to defeat him, they must then face off against a CPU control version of whatever tag team partner they choose. Completing the game with various characters results in some interesting endings. For example, beating the game as Magneto leads to him turning on his tag team partner M. Bison, becoming the new leader of Shadaloo in his quest for domination. Considering that he allows Sagat, Vega and Balrog to become his acolytes, he must have beaten his racism towards humans in this ending too. There are also endings to the game where characters appear who are not playable, such as Sakura and Dan from the Street Fighter Alpha series, who are present when completing the game as Storm. Another cool moment shows M. Bison trying to seduce Rogue into joining Shadaloo by offering to make her a human, with Chun-Li informing her that humans are not normal either. She can throw fireballs, for example. Or how about Dalsim simply eating a delicious Indian curry? A sinister ending is available where M. Bison defeats Magneto, and rather than just trying to conquer our planet, he manages to conquer the entirety of our universe. Across other endings, Cammy's Delta Red Force pop up, Guile makes an appearance in Charlie's completion, and in a fourth wall-breaking moment, Ken can be seen with his son playing the Xmen vs Street Fighter video game on a very bizarre-looking home console. Rather surprisingly, this version of the game is being played on a cartridge, leading me to suspect that it might be a bootleg copy, which of course we shall touch more on deeper into this iceberg. Ooh. The original arcade version of the game first arrived in Japan on September 25th, 1996, and the game ran on a Capcom System 2 arcade board, the same board as the recent Street Fighter Alpha games did too. Arcade 1UP have also released a small cabinet for consumers to purchase with this game on, along with Marvel vs Capcom Clash of Superheroes, X-Men Children of the Atom, but rather bizarrely the Super Nintendo game published by Capcom known as X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, a game that was never intended to be played using an arcade's layout. How strange. Promotional artwork for the game would include a striking image of X-Men hero Cyclops shaking hands with Street Fighter's Ryu, which is a great symbolic representation of the working relationship between Capcom and Marvel around the time of the game's release. Other promotional artwork depicts Cammy and Rogue throwing flying kicks at each other, with Ryu and Cyclops looking like they are ready to fight in the background. The game would also receive a near-perfect port to the Sega Saturn in 1997, which was only made possible due to being supported by a 4MB RAM cartridge that players could slot atop into the Sega Saturn. To make the game playable, this would be packaged alongside the game to deliver an arcade-perfect conversion for gamers at home. While the Sega Saturn conversion of this game was announced to see release in North America and other regions outside of Japan by Capcom USA themselves, Capcom would be forced to drop these plans due to Sega axing plans to manufacture the RAM cartridges required to play the game within the United States. Surprisingly, this huge obstacle did not prevent demand for the game, even though that by 1998, many of the US's major retailers were doing everything possible to clear out all of their old Sega Saturn inventory. Amongst the biggest companies who would opt to find a way around selling the game would be Electronic Boutique, who would sell import copies of the game with the RAM cartridge within select store branches. Plans to sell the bundle in Europe was also put in place by Capcom, but because Sega of America oversaw Sega of Europe, the region would drop support for the Sega Saturn as well. To give you an idea of how close the game going on sale was though to becoming a reality, in the UK the game was being advertised for release in March of 1998 for £49.99. The box art for the Japanese version of the game would depict all of the playable characters featured on the front cover, with the iconic handshaking image being shown on the back. There is also concept art available online showing Rogue and other characters for those who want to see more. Initially, there would be no plans to release the game on the Sony PlayStation, due to the fact that the system is not particularly good when it comes to handling 2D sprite-based games. After much demand from fans though, and the Saturn crashing out in the West, these plans would soon need to be changed. To make this possible, changes were made to the game for practicality reasons, including many character animation frames and background animations being cut from the game. Some idle poses look completely different or much more rigid due to these substantial differences. The PlayStation version runs with a lower screen resolution at all times, and the load times are much longer than with what can be found on the Saturn. The most striking change though is of course the removal of tag team combat. due to the PlayStation's working memory being too low to be able to handle 4 detailed sprites in the game simultaneously. Many sacrifices were made to be able to produce this version of the game at all. While there were 2 different console versions of this game, what less people will be aware of is there were 3 different arcade iterations that would make some subtle and not so subtle changes to the title. This was in part due to what Capcom saw as the inclusion of a game-breaking bug that could be found within the original, which was giving characters the ability to perform infinite combos, 99 plus hit onslaughts that could be used to devastate opponents. While not an intentional feature of the game, this did become something that many gamers grew fond of, being seen as an endearing element of the game that would complement its overall chaotic nature. Unique to the first version of the arcade game also was that both Ryu and Akuma were able to recover from their hop kicks in midair, and Ryu's Hurricane Super could push opposing players down, allowing the player to recover. By the second iteration of the game, these 2 fighters' ability to recover from their hop kicks were removed, and Ryu's Hurricane Super was changed to push players up rather than down. Further from this, Sim was altered too, so that when he performs a yoga drill, he can no longer do it the instant he leaves the floor, but instead now has to jump a small distance first, leading to a little more in-game balance. The third iteration though would lead to by far the most substantial changes, with Capcom making a strong effort to attempt to remove all known infinites. Further to this, Storm's ability to use her lightning attacks multiple times without even landing on her feet got taken away. These attacks can no longer cause opponents to fall on their back, and other moves in her arsenal were also tweaked. Cyclops and Juggernaut would be altered for version 3 as well, with their aerial fierce and roundhouses pushing players down, and Wolverine's Drill Claw can no longer throw an opponent across the entire screen. Substantial tweaking was also applied to the likes of Magneto, Chun-Li and Sim, all in a quest to make this game as balanced as possible. While the X-Men sprites were based on the characters who appeared in the X-Men animated show, on the Street Fighter side of things, Street Fighter Alpha would too receive its own animation, in the latter's case its own anime movie, and later a comic book series. With regards to the X-Men animation, where the characters were taken from, at points the show dealt with many social issues that were far more mature than what the average viewer would maybe expect from a kids show. There are some tamer issues such as a divorce theme in one episode, or loneliness in the episode titled No Mutant is an Island, but there are multiple episodes that feature around Christianity as a theme, or more shockingly in a children's show, there is a multitude of episodes featuring the World War II Holocaust as a major plot point, with Magneto developing his hatred for humans due to being a Holocaust survivor wanting revenge. Perhaps one of the more surprising storylines by today's standards unfolded in an episode known as Time Fugitives, which was inspired by AIDS hysteria of all things. Yep, a kids show featuring AIDS hysteria as a major plot device. X-Men. With X-Men vs Street Fighter being a Japanese produced game, I guess it is probably important to touch on the X-Men in Japan over this time period. Japan would receive the TV Tokyo dub of the animated series, which even came with a new theme that was called Rising. Further from this, the X-Men in Japan was broadcast with the scripts completely rewritten, presenting the show as a much sillier and more slapstick style of programming. They basically made the entire show a lot more like a typical Japanese anime, with Team Rocket-esque Pokemon-style humour, if that makes sense. This version of the show had a much more satirical tone than in the West, with a huge emphasis on comical ad-libbing, the same sort of thing that people here in Britain did with the French stop-motion animation show Le Ménage Enchanté, when creating the Magic Roundabout. Tying all of this right back around to what we are covering today, much of this was all in an effort to promote Japanese-produced Capcom games, starting of course with X-Men Children of the Atom, the game that first featured characters with the same art style as this very show. Interestingly, in the early 2000s, the show in Japan would be completely redubbed in Japanese again, this time receiving a more serious tone that matched up more closely with what had been produced previously in the West. This version of the show was broadcast on Toon Disney Japan. Even the Western intro and outro would be back here too. In other weirdness connected to the X-Men vs Street Fighter game, the game would ridiculously be ported to the 16-bit Super Nintendo, a 1998 effort made by bootleggers in Asia. What may surprise you about this pirate creation is that the game was made available on physical Super Nintendo cartridges, which included special copy protection to stop the game being able to be easily copied or run on most emulation software. The choppy game is full of a variety of assets pulled from various different video games and obviously does not run very well, but it does let you play as 8 different characters, offering 4 Street Fighters and 4 Xmen. Amusingly, it also includes a couple of characters who are not in Xmen vs Street Fighter on other formats, such as Iceman and Chun-Li wearing her alpha costume. The game, in reality, is a messed up version of Street Fighter 2 with no tag team mechanics and a ton of slowdown due to poor development. Despite all of this though, its existence remains rather hilarious in my opinion. Moving on, there is also a bootleg version of Xmen vs Street Fighter that was created to run on the Sega Mega Drive. This version of the game is so obscure that unfortunately it is yet to be dumped. However, footage can be found online of others playing this oddity in Russia. Perhaps one of the craziest facts regarding the Xmen vs Street Fighter video game is that the game's release 25 years ago marks perhaps the darkest period in the Marvel brand's entire history as a company. So while we have fond memories of how great and innovative this game was, 1996 was the closest period in all of our lifetimes for Marvel, along with the X-Men themselves, to all be dying out. In fact, things were so terrible for the company that they would go as far as to file for bankruptcy that very year. What also may come as a surprise, it was not just the fact that Capcom were doing great with their Street Fighter brand that Marvel was so willing to let them use their IPs. It was more of a case that they were looking to prostitute their assets out to anyone who was willing to pay, in a last-ditch effort to save them from their fall from grace. You see, the years leading up to the game had featured error after error from Marvel, and through the 70s and 80s, attempts had been made to try and move the brand further into TV and cinema, with it mostly resulting in failures. 1992 would lead to another crucial blow when they would lose 7 of their most prized artists, leaving the company to form Image Comics. After some corporate acquisitions, at the tail end of 1994, leading into December of 1996, the entire comic book industry was on its knees, so they began to do everything possible to stay afloat. Marvel's work with Capcom all happened through this strange period, with The Punisher's release in 93, Children of the Atom in 94, Marvel Superheroes in 95, followed up by X-Men vs Street Fighter in 1996. Marvel would fortunately be saved in 1997 when Toy Biz bought Marvel Entertainment Group to end the bankruptcy, forming a new corporation, Marvel Enterprises. Successfully escaping the bankruptcy situation, the Marvel vs Capcom video game series would continue, but there is no doubt about it that X-Men vs Street Fighter was developed in a very rough period for the comic book giant, providing the X-Men with much needed support. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the X-Men vs Street Fighter Iceberg explained. I hope I brought some new information to the table that you were not familiar with previously that relates to this classic game. If you enjoyed today's format, why not check out my Street Fighter 2 Iceberg that I uploaded on here a while ago on the channel. I would also be keen to know which game you would like to see me give this same style treatment to next. It is always fun to revisit these iconic games in different capacities. If you like this video, why not subscribe and hit that notification bell to be alerted whenever I have a new upload. I would adore your regular viewership. Finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to all of the wonderful people who extract enough pleasure from my work that they have gone the extra mile and even become Patreon backers in the process. So special thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Corey Marsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, Ron Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azra Archive, Drop Quinn Varela, Michael Calix, Ago, Jordan Duran, Angel Light 85, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Drew Peacock, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Dan Van Damme, Lewis Fiant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroversion.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who backs the channel on Patreon. Thank you so much for your kind support.